So it is my pleasure to invite our friend Jocelyn Bell, who is editor of Broadview Magazine, our award-winning United Church founded, but now broader reader audience magazine here in Canada. And she's here to we're sort of doing some cross promotion between the Mod Squad Book Club and Broadview's Reader Club. So I'll be joining them 1 month and she's joining us this month. And so I'll turn it over to you, Jocelyn, to let our participants know what you guys are up to at Broadview.
Thanks so much, Carmen. I am Jocelyn Bell. I'm the editor and publisher at Broadview Magazine. And it's a genuine pleasure for me to be among individuals who share a deep love for reading and the exchange of ideas and who appreciate the power of meaningful conversations. And so today I'm excited to maybe introduce you, or maybe you've attended, but it's to a wonderful opportunity that really aligns with our shared interests, and that is Broadview Magazine's National Online Reading Clubs. So what is a reading club with Broadview? Well, it's an hour-long Zoom event that happens 8 times a year. And during these sessions, we invite 3 writers or story subjects from the latest issue of Broadview to share their stories with us. Each presenter has about 5 minutes to delve into the heart of their articles, peeling back the layers of their words to reveal the stories within. After these short talks, the floor is open to our readers for questions and discussion. So it's an event where you get to interact directly with Broadview's writers and story subjects, creating a lively exchange of ideas. And many people have shared that this experience elevates ordinary magazine reading, making the stories come alive in fresh and exciting ways. One of the qualities of these reading clubs is our dedication to diversity in both the range of topics and the presenters themselves. So take, for example, our October reading club, where we discussed online sports gambling and the activists who are taking a stand against this addictive pastime. We also spoke to a woman who found meaning in life after a suicide attempt. And we took a deep dive into Broadview's own history, looking at our historical relationship with Indigenous peoples in the 1800s. And our presenters included a Canadian living in Australia, a Jamaican-born queer Torontonian, and a United Church minister. Each of these presenters, in their own unique way, uses their voice, gifts, and courage to make the world a better place. And in a world that often feels so polarized and overrun by divisive voices, Broadview Reading Clubs offer an antidote. It's a reminder that we can bridge our differences, find common ground, and create meaningful conversations. So now I'd like to just briefly tell you about the next Broadview National Online Reading Club, which is on Monday, December 4th at 7 p.m. And Carmen will be there, as she mentioned. That's Eastern time. And so we are going to be presenting 3 incredible speakers for this event. The first one is Alison Brooks Starks, who will dive into the appearance of the word homosexual in the Bible and offer a surprising and thought-provoking perspective on this important topic. Mark Ramsey will share his insights into immigrants' efforts to preserve their mother tongues in Canada, shedding light on the uphill battle that they face. And finally, Pieta Woolley will recount her interview with Artificial Intelligence Jesus. It's a chatbot that she interviewed, and it will be an intriguing exploration of the intersection of technology and faith. Following tonight's event, you'll be emailed a registration link, I'm told, to join Broadview's next online reading club. The event is free. I encourage you to sign up, mark your calendars, and prepare for a really exceptional evening of discussion. And if December 4th doesn't work for you, no problem. Just Google Broadview National Online Reading Clubs and you'll find our webpage with all the needed information for upcoming dates. So that's it for me. Thank you so much for your attention, and I hope to see you at the next online reading club on December 4th. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jocelyn. If anybody has any quick questions for Jocelyn, I invite you to raise your hand. Otherwise, you can read Broadview, or you can Google Broadview National Reading Clubs, and the information will be available for you online on their websites.
I can add the link into the chat if that's.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, do that.
Harness the power of technology. I love it. So I'm really pleased to welcome my friend, John Havens. John is the person that introduced me to this book, And so you'll notice in the Mods Book Squad, sometimes we have the authors who come discuss the books with us. Sometimes, especially if they're United Church authors, then that becomes really an easy ask. But sometimes they're a person who, I just think that they're going to be a good discussant. And John was the person that introduced me to Doughnut Economics. We met last year at the Vatican at Humanity 2.0, which is an organization that is sort of trying to cross disciplinary or sectoral boundaries around how we think about human flourishing, which, as you will have seen in the book, is a big theme in this particular book. John is a former actor and author. He's the author of Artificial Intelligence and Hacking Happiness. And he also is currently serving as the Sustainability Practice Lead at IEEE, which is the world's largest professional association dedicated to advancing technological innovation and excellence for the benefit of humanity. And so I will let John say a couple more things about himself. Technology is our friend. It is also sometimes the bane of our existence. I am not on my own computer, so I have lost his bio. My computer is probably flying somewhere at 39,000 feet because I left it on a plane last night. So, John, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, just that my heart breaks for you with leaving your computer on the plane. That's like, oh, there, but for the grace of God goes my electronics. Mainly, I just want to say thank you so much, Carmen, Reverend Carmen, and to all of you. It's a pleasure and an honor to be invited. I'm happy to talk more about my bio as needed. I think here, one thing I'll say is a lot of my heroes are women in economics. Kate Raworth, I've had the chance. I don't think I've ever met her in person, but I've spoken to her a couple times. And her book just really transformed a lot of my thinking, along with people like Eleanor Ostrom, Donella Meadows. So I think some of my favorite thinkers in the economic space are women. And another huge influence is a woman named Rianne Eisler. So anyway, any of those people that are useful to speak about. And Carmen, I'm happy to say more about myself if you want, or we can dive right into whatever you'd like.
Well, let's give you the opportunity to share a little bit about your own, I guess, faith orientation, because probably as somebody who I met sort of in non-church circles, you also have an interest in, I guess, the role that like faith and spirituality can play in our discernment about how do we work towards this world of human prosperity and a flourishing web of life. So because a little birdie told me, it might have been you, that you went to seminary or you were like preparing to go into ordered ministry at some point.
I actually went to college at a small Christian school called Messiah College in Grantham, Pennsylvania. And they had a program with Temple University. So I always joke that I was at Messiah and Temple, like subtle names, and I was a history and theater major. What happened is after my sophomore year, I had a wonderful theater professor who counseled that I should not go into the pulpit if I felt God was calling me to act. So I went to New York City in 1991, and I was a professional actor for about 15 years or so. So I did one Broadway show, a bunch of off-Broadway shows, and then some TV and film. I was on Law and Order. I played a cop a number of times. I was in a movie, had a small part called The Thomas Crown Affair. And from a faith standpoint, I had a wonderful, introduction into a lot of different worldviews living in New York City in the early 90s. And then my mom actually went to Boston University when I went to college, and she got her Master's of Divinity. So she is technically a minister in the Methodist tradition, although she has never been in a pulpit. She wanted to get that background and experience to help drive a group that she was a part of for a number of years called Aldersgate Ministries, which helped run large-scale events for Methodist, large Methodist groups. In terms of my life, I try to live a life that brings glory essentially to Jesus. That's kind of the core of who I am. And by that, I mean trying to be kind to others and live a life where I can do work that brings him glory. And Carmen, it's been such a pleasure to get to know Carmen. I've had this wonderful blessing of being able to go to the Vatican 3 times for work. Twice was with this organization called Humanity 2.0. Another event was with Jeffrey Sachs, the Economist, and I've been lucky or blessed. After I finished acting, I've always been a geek, meaning I love technology and science fiction, and so I kind of married my love of story as an actor with writing, and I've written 10 books. 3 of them are traditionally published through Penguin. One is on social media, one is on personal data, and the last one from 2016 is about artificial intelligence and ethics. It's called Artificial Intelligence, Embracing Our Humanity to Maximize Machines. My dad, who passed away in 2011, was a psychiatrist. So again, just a real blessing. I grew up in a household with a psychiatrist, a woman who was going to be a minister. I ended up being an actor and a writer. I'm also a musician. So I sort of live in the world of the unseen or the spiritual. And it's been a wonderful way to now I work in technology in my day job. I work at IEEE. It's the world's largest engineering association. And I helped shepherd with about 700 volunteers their largest work on artificial intelligence and ethics. And then in terms of this book in particular, I met Kate. I ran a group that she was a part of. Really, we do a lot of volunteer work, so she came to a couple of meetings, but she joined as a member, I was thrilled. And I'm happy to talk more about this book, of course, in a minute. But one thing I'm always wondering about is how to think about technology where economics that drives the technology, how can it be framed so that it always prioritizes ecological flourishing and human well-being in an equity-oriented way? And Carmen is one of my go-to Indigenous thinkers and leaders where I've learned so much just in the past couple of years. And I run a big sustainability program at work. And economics, that word has really expanded for me with Kate Raworth and frankly with leaders like Carmen, how to think about what does it mean to bring value to the world. And it's obviously not just with money alone.
Thanks for augmenting what I no longer had on paper in front of me. So I put the link for or the title of John's book, Artificial Intelligence. I just read it last month. It is excellent. I love the way that in that book, and we will turn to Doughnut Economics in a second, but in that book you put like these little sort of fictional vignettes to sort of bring to life the points that you're making about ethics and AI in the chapters of the book. And I was thinking about one of my colleagues in Vancouver when we wrote an open letter around sexual orientation and gender identity policies in schools to say that, the Christians that like those Christians that were fighting affirming inclusion of children regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity in schools didn't represent the full spectrum of Christian thought or belief on in our church we say that our human sexuality and gender expression and gender identity are gifts from God. And so he was interviewed on the radio and the announcer said, do you think that your letter will make a difference? And he said no, because the only thing that makes a difference is stories, and when those stories touch our hearts. So an open letter is not going to change people's minds. It just shows the world that we are standing together in solidarity to say not in the name of my faith. But so when you took like stories and made them like tangible and like, oh yeah, I feel for the protagonist of this story that's woven through the things, it just made it that much easier to think about the real implications of all of the ways that we need to think about ethics in artificial intelligence. So thank you for writing that book. Okay, but everybody who is here because we all read, I'm on Patty's computer here, Doughnut Economics, 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist. You can see mine's all dog-eared and marked up. But first of all, like when we were at the Vatican, you had sort of leaned over and was like, everybody in this room needs to read this book. And I was one of those people in the room and I hadn't read this book. But why? Why is this a book that you're actively promoting, or that that you think is important to introduce people to when they are thinking about the way that we show up in the world?
Sure. Well, one of the most moving things that inspired the last 15 years of my life is someone introduced me to a famous speech that Robert Kennedy gave. I think it's at the University of Indiana, and it's typically called the Beyond GDP speech. So it's about a year before he died. And if you study gross domestic product, or that sort of statistical way of measuring the world, he explains it, to your point, Carmen, about kind of a story. Like, I love economics, so I'll get into sometimes statistical analysis and algorithms and formulas, and it's geeky fun. But for me, what he talked about in that speech beautifully was, here are all the things that the GDP does not measure. He talked about what it does measure, like it was in the 60s or whatever. So the cost of cigarettes, advertising. The GDP, for instance, goes up also when a tanker filled with oil runs into an island, for instance. The oil and the cleaning it up, what's measured is the jobs to get the oil cleaned up, but there's no measure. It was not built to measure the environment. So, for instance, the fact that region or that ocean, coral reefs or what have you, are decimated for 10 years or longer, it just wasn't built to measure that. So his speech, it's a wonderful speech. You can read it. It's a pretty short video, but it talks about, it doesn't measure things like the joy of our children, or he just lists these beautiful things. And having written a lot about positive psychology and measuring using technology, things that people normally would call qualitative or subjective, these are terms that somebody used at some point that, to me, they're useful, in academia, and I don't mean to be pejorative to them, but, one thing is also, like, do we always need them? Like, if you're sitting talking with your daughter or your aunt or your grandchild, and someone walks in the room and says, I have these heart monitors and these sweat monitors, and I can tell by your eyes dilating, you love your granddaughter. You'd be like, you're correct. Thanks so much. Thanks for your time. But someone made a decision, and mainly it's white guys, I think, and not to be negative to white guys, I am one, but that all these sort of decisions kind of became fact and ideology. And the book, Kate's book, talks about neoliberalism, this sort of, to me, this invisible force that has become pretty much the most powerful force in the world. GDP is not evil, right? I don't want to give the concept like this is evil. And I'm also not, I have a lot of friends that work in big companies. It's not useful necessarily to talk about morality and evil per se with these things. What I like to talk about, and Kate does this brilliantly, is what is it you're measuring? And you've probably heard the old adage, what you measure is what you value. But the GDP, when it was created after the Second World War at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire, and I've been there for a meeting on a lot of people wanted to create sort of a new Bretton Woods and a new way to think about money type stuff. It was built after the Second World War, when so many things had been decimated and ruined, meaning infrastructure, buildings, lives, of course. That rebuilding and growth was a cultural value, which makes sense. But now exponential growth in and of itself, and GDP, when it doesn't measure things like, and this is one of the reasons I love women economists so much, is because GDP wasn't built to measure caregiving. And in general, around the world, still today, caregiving is done largely by women. But Rian Eisler has done some leading work in this, creating statistical analyses that are complementary to the GDP statistics. When you measure caregiving, the GDP goes up, and that's whether it's a man, a woman, a trans person, whoever it is, someone taking care of a child, a caregiver. When that's measured, like in Maryland, the state, for instance, it's measured. It's not a big deal. It's like, Bob, are you taking care of Susan? Yep, that's my daughter. Yep, all right. And you can measure things for taxes. And anyway, this is a long answer, except to say that like measuring the full worth of a person, in the West, we do this weird, very damaging thing of being like, well, hold on, our rationality is okay, and here's the things that we can quantifiably measure. This other stuff is squishy and we can't measure it, but we can in places like Bhutan with gross national happiness, or many indigenous cultures, or what have you. They measure things that they count. How they count them, how they, actually put them into accounting type metrics, is something I've been working on for years to enlighten people with. And Kate's book came along and does it better than most books, especially the first chapter. I think it's the first chapter, maybe the introduction. I tend to confuse them. That really just eviscerates neoclassical economics, which, by the way, most economists I know like to eviscerate neoclassical economics, because this idea of like one man on an island, scarcity, it's just not how I think. Well, it's just not how most people live. If you were living next to a neighbor and they came and said, we're really suffering, can you, help us out? Probably you're going to help them out. You're not going to be like, no, and slam the door. And so anyway, that's a long answer, Carmen. I want to make sure to be shorter with my responses.
No, it's all good. It's interesting. Another world famous economic thinker, Amartya Sen, who won the 96 Nobel Prize in Economics, he talks in the introduction to his book, Development as Freedom, about exactly that instance where neighbors were not helping each other was what inspired him to really dig into the intersections of like all of our different types of freedom. And he makes the argument that our political freedom, our financial freedom, our physical freedom, our spiritual freedom, they're all tied together. And so when you experience one type of freedom, you're more likely to experience other types of freedom. But when you experience what he calls an unfreedom, then you're also like, it spirals and creates a reinforcing feedback loop, like Raworth talks about in her book, that can also impede those other freedoms. And it was his experience of living through partition and the religious wars that were happening in Bangladesh when he was growing up, and seeing a man murdered in front of him for being the wrong religion, working in the wrong neighborhood, that inspired him to sort of dig into all of these concepts. So I think that's another thing I really liked about Doughnut Economics, is her talking about towards the end of the book, that we can be a glass, like when we look at all of the existential threat that we're facing, it's very easy to be glass half full, like I have this, I always like to quote movies a lot. So if you ever saw, and I might have even quoted this one last month, but French Kiss with Kevin Kline and Meg Ryan, and she's scared of flying, and she's in this flight simulator. She's like, we're going down, we're going down, we're going down. And I like, sometimes when I read the news, that's where my brain wants to go, right? but doing these thought swaps where you're like, it's not just a crisis, it's also an opportunity. Like, I love the hopefulness that she finds in, we're the first generation in human history to have as much information about as many things as we do. Much of that information has caused the crises that we are in, but we're also like, the flip side of that is we're the first generation that has the access to information to actually pivot and to change, and to imagine a flourishing future where we don't have to continue to repeat the same old behaviors. So I'm interested to know, because you work for a really big organization, like almost 500,000 members, or over 400,000 members. And I imagine your job is also a pretty big job, being the sustainability program lead. So like, how are you using these sort of like reframing our understandings of our economic world in terms of how you do your work, and what that means for your members?
Well, I'll be honest, it's really hard. And I also want to point out like reality, like I work in sustainability, but I'm sitting in my living room and I have a gas fireplace. When I turn it on, It increases my well-being because I don't have to build a wood fire. and I love a fire, but I'm keenly aware I'm using gas, you know. So one thing is sort of like a perspective of like, it's just really hard to change behavior. And for me, I'm 54, and you know, like Mad Men. I'm having been an actor, I also like using, you know, cultural shows and stuff. And if anyone here has seen Mad Men, which is one of my favorite shows of late, there's this scene where the family's having a picnic. I don't know if you saw this episode, but the family's having a picnic, and when they finish, the father, the main guy, John Hamm, gets up and just takes the everything that's on the all the trash that's on the ground cover that they've used. He just shakes it and leaves the trash there. It's a wonderful moment where the people creating the show sort of pointed out. I mean, they smoke and drink constantly during the day, so that's another thing too. But the pollution, you know, for myself growing up, except for that TV ad in the States, and I would assume this may be, if not offensive to indigenous audiences, something, but there was what was supposed to be an American Indian,
The crying Indian.
crying Indian, who, if you know this as an actor, it was a famous Mexican actor, which is kind of funny. Like, he's a Mexican American actor, not, I mean, indigenous to Mexico. But anyway, I bring all this up to say, when you talk about consumerism, and I really don't like the word consumer, I do not think that God created us to be consumers. We can be customers, right? And I've done work with big PR firms. I did a survey of like 5,000 people, and we asked all these people, if you could, would you rather be called a customer or a consumer? And we gave definitions, and then we're like, customer's good. Because when we're defined as a consumer, then our worth comes from not just eating or drinking or making money or to pay our bills or to have good stuff. It's the mentality that's so deeply inbred in me. For instance, you always must have more. And also speed, efficiency, competition, excessive growth, right? Not just growth. And I don't mean like maturing as a person, growth like scale and size. And I work in artificial intelligence. I went to this meeting, I spoke at a meeting yesterday at Northeastern, and a lot of times people talk, and I just get anxious because they're like, we only have so much time. All the world's information has to be used. And this guy who's the CEO of a major education company, he's like, young people can now go to college in 2 years versus 4, because who needs 4 years of college? And I'm like, well, hold on. If they want to go online for 2 years, that's cool. But college is also about, for a lot of people, learning about life and maybe meeting someone you want to date and like getting out of the house and just all these things. But there's such a, for me, intense sense of rapid growth, right? And going back to this book, it was such a relief to read a book that was just like, okay. So to answer your question about how I talk about stuff at work, first of all, is just to let people know, if they don't understand economics or statistics or whatever, if what you're really measuring, that's what in the business world, key performance indicators. You probably know that term on the call, a lot of you. If the key performance indicator is growth and scale first, then you also probably don't have the metrics to know how you're harming the planet or people. And frankly, you know, you don't want to kill people necessarily, and most people don't want to overtly hurt the planet. But anyway, I work a lot with engineers. So there's a term called boundary conditions, which essentially is like when you're going to build something, what's the sort of scope of what you're doing? And here I try to use engineering terms versus like, you know, climate change terms, which sometimes separate people because it gets political, and say, do you know the science of whatever it is, the system that you're talking about? And without, again, going into, you know, the science of climate change, but saying like, when we are going to build this tool, especially artificial intelligence, for instance, a lot of you have heard of Chat GPT. That particular AI tool uses a massive amount of water for the data centers to cool data centers, like millions and millions of gallons. And I work in artificial intelligence and ethics. So a lot of what my work is to say, hold on, let's use all these terms of like finger pointing and companies are bad, and let's put them over here as systems thinkers. And again, this is like the great Donella Meadows, a lot of thinkers in systems thinking. At the outset of design, there's this real irony with AI ethics, and people use this term called AI for good a lot. And they'll be like, we can cure cancer using this new tool, ChatGPT. And I'm like, I want to cure cancer, but not at the expense of taking all the water out of our American aquifers. The New York Times has done a big expose on the aquifers in America. So the grinding of the data centers to do this productivity, where if we don't measure that water as it goes down, then we are literally kind of thinking and computing ourselves out of the ability to survive. And so that's usually where, and I said I was going to have shorter answers, and so far I haven't. But that's where I go to my engineer friends and say, civil engineering, electrical engineers, let's get together and bring in amazing folks like Carmen and other folks who have a perspective about things that we aren't measuring, that we must measure, or unwittingly we are going to be causing harm that we can never, unchange.
Yeah. I thought the part is probably 2/3 of the way through the book where she's talking about, if we adequately taxed like the lithium and cadmium and things like that are required for, the digital when like people's jobs get replaced by digital functions, either like robotics or computers or whatever. And she's like, it wouldn't necessarily be such a huge cost savings if we had to pay for the amount of resources that are being taken from the earth. And I really liked that because I think, it's, yeah, she's a very ethical thinker, right? Like she's thinking through the implications of so many different things and the ways that they interconnect. And I love, I hated the term when you told me about this book and it was called Doughnut Economics. I was like, what is this? And this is the stupidest thing ever. And I can see why she called it the donut. And it's catchy because now like you can walk around and say like, oh, I'm reading Doughnut Economics, and people say like, oh, I read that. That's such a good book. But this idea of like our economic decisions should not only be determined by calculations and math and algorithms, but by this model where we have to fit in between our social foundations and our planetary boundaries. And I really love that. There was one thing in here that I really wanted, I flagged it, influencing social behavior. So like on page 106, she talks about network effects also influence social behavior as illustrated by the power of a prominent example. And so she talked about Lula da Silva in Brazil, and like when he said he had cancer and he got it from smoking, and then like more people investigated like smoking as a cause of cancer, and then like started to quit smoking after this president that they had elected and really loved got sick. And then Malala Yousafzai, and her passion around education for girls and women. So do you see in all of this like trying to bring some of these less dominant forms of thinking about how we live and behave in the world in our corporate and economic transactions? Do you see like spaces where you're hopeful on how that social effect is starting to happen in terms of how people's worldviews or perspectives are changing?
I do, in one sense. A lot of like indigenous thinkers who I respect, there's a term called the Great Awakening, which I think coming from a place of faith, and I know you, Carmen, are a minister, and a lot of folks on the call are people of faith. It's, the transformation that I'll speak for myself. Like, I remember asking my mom, what does it mean to accept Jesus? And I had gone to church, I think it was like 13, and I'd gone to church since I was 4. And I knew all the stories about Jesus. I had a wonderful community church. Christmas had wonderful traditions. But I said to my mom, what does that actually mean? And she said, well, you go into a room and you accept Christ into your heart. And I'm like, does like lightning flash? Like what happens? And she said, no, it's faith. And I so remember it because that is exactly what it is, right? A leap of faith. And remember going to my room and asking Christ to enter my heart. And I didn't necessarily feel a big thing. But since then, I can tell you a number of different stories where I know beyond the shadow of a doubt that I would say just for me, but that Christ is real in my heart and in my life. So I think that sort of awakening, and I don't necessarily mean people accepting Christ, but I think after COVID, there's an area I'm working a lot in, and Carmen, I want to talk to you about this more, which is loneliness and isolation. In the US, the Surgeon General, his name is Vivek Murthy, and he came out with a wonderful report. I mean, the report's about something pretty scary, but the report is really proactive and has a lot of ways to be hopeful. But you mentioned smoking. 1 in 2 people in the US struggles with isolation that isn't necessarily at the point of, say, suicide, but it's also not just like a kind of depression we all fall into from time to time. I bring this up because the physical aspects of loneliness in the report, again, US Surgeon General, loneliness has the same effects as smoking 15 cigarettes a day, the same thing as obesity. And apparently it's the equivalent longer term isolation, like more than a year, really struggling with isolation can take up to 1 or 1.5 years off a person's life. So the reason I find this to be ironically encouraging is I don't know, like here's the joke. You did a joke before, so I think we've all heard this joke about the guy who's standing on his house and the floodwaters start to rise, and a friend comes along with a boat and says, get in the boat. And he's like, nope, God's going to save me. And then the waters keep rising and another boat comes. Bob, jump in the boat. And the guy says, no, God's going to save me. And then the water's just coming up to air and the helicopter comes. Get in the helicopter. No, God's going to save me. And he dies and goes to heaven. And the guy's upset at God, like, where were you? And he's like, I sent you 2 boats and a helicopter. Like, I don't mean to make a joke out of isolation because having struggled with it myself at very intense levels. The reason I bring this up is that if 1 in 2 people are struggling with isolation, and it's pretty common in the West, the UK actually has a minister, not a religious minister, but minister meaning like the UK House of Lords designation of loneliness. If 1 in 2 people struggles with isolation, technology can help connect people. Like dating apps and stuff already do this. You want to meet people nearby, but a lot of churches and temples have greatly the number of people that go to these institutions has gone way down. So I'm working. I have a new idea called Together Land. It's a workshop. I'm basing it off of the Alcoholics Anonymous model, where basically I'm hoping if 1 in 2 people really struggles with isolation, if we're able to do anything we can to connect people in community, anything we can, like legally, but also the technology can help it. But having worked in positive psychology for years, this pheromonal need to connect, and we're online right now. It's still a beautiful way to have community, but we're just built as humans to be also face to face. So what I'm excited about, I guess, Carmen, and again, I'm not doing well with the short answers, is where God has kind of said, here's 2 boats and a helicopter. The world is crying out. And Pope Francis, if you haven't read the Laudate Deum that he just wrote, it's a beautiful treatise on treating the planet as a person, as St. Francis of Assisi did. And if we now have this opportunity where it's really scary to think about climate change and all these things, and it's really hard being alone, but if in one sense the only answer is to change all of our economic systems, like Kate is advocating in her book, to really prioritize keeping the planet safe for 8 billion people, and then really the only thing we can do to avoid death is be in community. That's I don't think God is causing pain for us to be in pain and purpose, but the pain's happening, and I think God is revealing to us the need and the joy that will happen when we realize the planet is a living entity and a beautiful part of God's creation that we are a part of, not separate from, to extract from. And when we are given the opportunity to sort of lose all these constructs of competition and this and that, which, as ideologies, if people believe them, I don't mean to disparage them, but if 1 in 2 people, and many of those are young people and they are committing suicide, if 1 in 2 people needs to be connected to someone else, my answer is any ideology that does anything but has people in love and kindness reaching out to each other and building community, I'm not interested. I'm not interested because it's not working to keep people safe and having love. So that's where I think this mentality from Kate really helps. For me, it's just it only makes me feel joy. It's really hard, but it's joy as compared to this anxiety of like, I got to be faster, faster, faster all the time and comparing myself all the time to AI. It's like saying, in closing, this part of, I go to so many conferences where people are like, AI just beat humans in this. It can write better. It's better at acting, all these things. And it's, in one sense, it's like saying, hey, that Ferrari, it goes faster than you can run. And I'm like, yeah, that's okay. But God made us, I believe that God made all of us, and he knows all the hairs in our head, he knows the sparrow, etc. The joy that I feel reading a book like Doughnut Economics and talking to friends like Carmen is what we're doing here, is coming together in community and really recognizing that God has given each of us worth, I believe, just by coming into existence.
I love that. In the example in the book where she's talking about like alternative forms of currency, and that example in Switzerland where there's like the care currency, where anybody over 60 can like earn credits for caring for other elderly people, and then they have the right to then draw on care as they age and are starting to need more support. It struck me a lot and reminded me of this other book that I read this year called Beloved Economies, Transforming How We Work. And they talk a lot and she touches on it, but I think their book came out after hers, so I don't know that she'd read it or known about this work that was happening in the US, but they basically talk about how one of the premises is analyzing who has the rights to design a decision, right? And so she talks a lot about how, like, when you involve more constituents into making decisions, whether that's like public budgeting for municipalities or those kinds of projects, that you get more diverse answers that include, like, we don't have to then talk about necessarily centering people who are marginalized, because when you go out to all of your constituents and say, like, what are we not thinking of when we're gonna come about making this decision, that's the importance of slowing down and not having this poverty of time, is to, like, we have all the time in the world to, like, try and iterate and get feedback and involve more people. And that's really how human-centered design works. And we get very good at that when we're, like, improving the functionality of a can opener so it works for somebody that has, like, a disability in their hands, but we don't necessarily think about it in some of these larger systemic ways that we are in the world. I want to give our readers a chance to ask questions too. So, but first, I skipped over a question a little bit ago from Kathy Hamilton. She wanted to know, what was the essence of a customer versus a consumer? And then I see, Judy, you have a thing here too that I'll read, but maybe you can answer that. What is the difference between a customer and a consumer?
For me, if the question's for me, when we did our survey, consumer is a sort of definition of a person holistically. I guess, like, you might use a term like Democrat. Like, I'm not voting right now. In the States, I'd call myself a Democrat, but it's sort of one aspect of identity, where consumer is this sense of an identity of you at all times. Sort of, I was pictured like Gollum, from Lord of the Rings. I will consume at all times, versus when I want to buy something, I'm a customer. And that means I'm excited to pay money. I have brands I like, but it's a sort of a situation of parity, meaning equality, versus consumer. I lose value to the consumer world or to economics, whatever, when I can't consume anymore. So when I don't have money and I don't have credit, that's why I rail so much against consumer. also this idea of consuming resources, taking from the planet, extracting, the sort of certainly neoliberal way that the planet by and large has been positioned. The planet exists, animals exist to give me stuff I need, as compared to, well, you're not really living in unison or joy, respecting animals and nature as a entity that God is as the creator created. It's extractive. So anyway, that's how I determined. And when we did the survey, people seem to like it. You know, they're like, yeah, I like being a customer, but I don't want to be defined. Because by the way, in GDP, if the only way that one is measured is through GDP, then as a person, everything else about you, your faith, your emotion, your musicianship, whatever, all the sort of other half that's not the rational side that can buy things is not measured. So I refuse to only be measured for the things I buy, because that does not tell you even a remote majority about who I am.
I wondered if, Kathy, I wondered about, I have it flagged to go back and look at her footnotes and figure out where she got the statistic from, but I was really surprised. And I guess I shouldn't be, because the former president of the United States is like a living example of this, but that it's the 1% that are most likely to live outside their means, right? And when you combine that with this like networking and nudging and the social proof of that, and how much, so like you bring that into this whole worldview around like consumerism, and the drive to always be having more and more and more, even to the point where like you're burning bridges and things kind of start to spiral out of control, to keep up with the Joneses, but like on a really, really unsustainable scale. And I think that filters into how we care for the planet sometimes too, you know, like I really love it when people who have a high public profile are able to say, you know, we need to think radically differently about how we're taking things from the earth. But a lot of it is sort of glorified greenwashing, right? Like you look at Leonardo DiCaprio gives like tens of millions of dollars to environmental charities, but he has still have this like massively outsized footprint in terms of his own greenhouse gas emissions, and like has literally bought enough carbon credits to offset his lifestyle to be considered net zero. Like he's bought enough trees and had them planted that he could have reforested the entire country of Mexico. So like rather than scaling back on like what he's purchasing or how he's using resources in the world, he's only using like he's only got the plug out of the tub, but he hasn't like stopped the water from flowing into it, like she talks about in the book, right? So it's interesting to me to think about that customer versus consumer in terms of how that plays out in our sustainability. Does anybody have, let's open it up for questions and your reactions to the book.
Hello, thank you. I was trying to unmute myself. However, to let everybody else know, I think we have to raise our hands, and then with the options at the bottom of the screen, and then Carmen can give us permission to unmute. Well, this book is, to me, it's incredible, and I find it such a gift. I have managed most of my life out of the workforce. I went to university, I studied science, I worked as a computer programmer, and then I had a family and felt somebody should be at home to look after the kids because I couldn't figure out how to hire a nanny. My husband didn't want to do it, so I said, okay, I'll do it. And that started just my being not in the general flow. And I've also always had a particular outlook on life. And part of it comes from being a scientist. I have never been able to understand this concept that governments have that we can keep on growing. And the and the economy can keep on growing, and we can keep on getting more and more things. And I take that back to my background as a scientist, where I learned about the conservation of energy. And the whole world is based on the idea that you can't manufacture energy. It just changes from form to form. And I felt, since that was the basis of our natural world, the idea that we could, as humans, manufacture a system which had no end to it was just crazy. This is just little old Wendy, housewife, now having these ideas. And golly gosh, I find out this very educated and experienced economist is among a group of people having the same idea. And of course, they are able to talk about it in much more elevated language, and hopefully with lots of words and examples and reasoning can bring governments to hear what they're saying. But she said other things, which I've always thought about, which is like tax loopholes. That's a crazy idea. Always wanting to buy things and have more things and speed up. So, but I think I've realized that the book, I think, is written for professionals. It reads well. She's a really good writer and quite humorous, and brings everyday examples into what she's saying. But I think it's like an insider's book. She's written it for other economists. And I think it comes down to the layperson to be very simple. And it's people that need to change their attitudes. And we need to actually be able to live differently than our governments and our businesses are encouraging us to live. We need to say, no, I can have the same clothes, the same furniture, all the same stuff. I can share with my neighbors. And these things are starting to happen among the younger people, the younger generation. So I was very optimistic reading this book. I felt so justified that somebody else was having the same ideas that I'd had for years and have lived by. We've lived a very simple life. I'm very happy that I see in younger generations the attitudes that are needed. But I think as just citizens, we'll really have to persuade our governments to get on board with this new kind of economics, and let them know we don't want endless tax loopholes. We don't want to be able to buy and buy and buy. We don't want to all become millionaires because our house prices have gone up. We need to say to them, we are content just to be alive, have a place to live, have enough food to eat, and we want to share what we have and make sure everyone else in the world, and stop pushing us to grow all the time. So I like the book.
Thanks so much, Wendy. We probably should never trust me completely when I say something's written for lay readers. So I read a lot and sometimes I get desensitized to highly academic language. Kathy, I see your hand.
So I've just returned from a trip to Iceland, and I discovered that Iceland uses geothermic heat to produce electricity for Reykjavik, and heats water, which goes to people's houses, so you don't have to have a hot water tank. You just get hot water from your pipes. And that hot water also heats people's houses through the pipes under their floors. And then once it's done heating people's houses, it moves under the roads so that you can melt the snow and you don't have to do snow clearing. And that just seemed to me like a really awesome whole circle process. So I want to go back to the hot water that is produced by ChatGPT and wondering whether we could both use it to cure cancer, which would be really, really cool, and somehow use that heat in other ways. And that just seems to me to be where this process is going.
John, I'm going to turn it over to you to answer that question, because I love that.
I would love to go to Iceland. I travel a lot, so I got to go to the Reykjavik airport, and just flying into that airport is still one of the most exciting times I've had. You know, like this. I remember, like, I fly all the time, so it's not that exciting anymore, and I feel guilty about the travel. But I just was glued to the side because, like, this long expanse of ice, and then that was the most beautiful airport I've ever been to, hands down. If you get a chance, like, go to Iceland, but just go to the airport. Like, the gift shop was amazing. It, like, you could eat off the floor. Anyway, so thanks for that memory. The thing that what we really want to focus on, and the work I'm trying to lead, is not about demonizing, as it were, how the water would be used, you know, to your point, but is what happens a lot in the circles I'm in. Everyone justifies growth because we can cure cancer, right? I'm not going to make fun of curing cancer. My mom had it. She's okay. I want cancer to be cured. But when people really have an agenda to drive growth and mainly money, you know, and they don't know, or they do know, that by curing cancer of X amount of people, the amount of water that's being taken from aquifers in the States is going to kill millions of people. And not because, oh gosh, climate change is happening. It's because, for like ChatGPT, for people to, you know, along with maybe trying to cure cancer, redo their PowerPoints, you know, like, not a reason to drain the world of its water. So mostly what people like Kate Raworth also inspire in me is a wonderful testament to say to engineers, thinkers, policymakers, hold on. Do you know the harms that you'll cause, not intentionally, to the planet with what you're doing? And if someone's like, what do you mean? And then you mention the water thing. Now, the next thing that happens, however, is when companies are like, yeah, we're looking into that. And the answer is like, bup, 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 for me is like, bup, 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 nope, bup, hit. Because when that water's taken out of an aquifer, from my understanding, it takes 16,000 years for it to replace naturally. So we're getting to like the Johannesburg, literally day zero that Johannesburg faced a number of years ago. And when the water is gone, it is like, I mean, you know, it's just what it is. Like, agriculture is gone, you know, like the drought, like, think people move, and the systems stuff that breaks down with climate, immigration, and all these things. Mostly what I'm trying to do in my work is to say, ask systems thinkers and engineers, you are the world leading experts in one sense, with knowing when you build a car or whatever it is. It's not that you're going to put the parts together. You have to source the parts. And then when the parts are worn out, how do you do what's called circular design? How do you reuse and recycle? Like my mom, I was just visiting her a few weeks ago in Columbus. I live in New Jersey. She has the same chairs that I had when I was a boy. You know, she's 82. You know, it's like, it can be done. And she's not like an ascete. You know, she's not monastic. She still buys food, you know. Anyway, thank you for your question about Iceland. And we can do both. But there's also the opportunity. There is the opportunity. Like, you can't go to meetings where I work and say, can we just not do some of the stuff we're doing and just figure this out for a while? No, don't hinder innovation. So what Kate helps us do is redefine innovation. Innovation by excessive growth. And someone had the great quote here about, you know, thinking that growth is whatever is economists or whatever. It can't happen. The physics of what we have available to us as resources will not let us continue the way we're going. So we want to cure cancer, of course, but if the tools that are going to help us cure cancer hurt more people, then we got to figure something else out. And by the way, there's so many people doing good work with ways to use other things besides water for data centers. We'll get there, but we can't afford to have companies justifying using water for a year, 2 years, 5 years, where they say, because most of them do, we're aware of this, we're working on it. Well, no, you can't say that anymore. And I'm happy to regulate the living snot out of them if it was up to me, and tax them, because it means their kids will also suffer with a lack of water too. I don't want them to suffer either.
Yeah.
And thank you for the question.
Thanks, Kathy. Nora.
Actually, I was interested to hear about Iceland. I was there briefly, and my main memory of it was taking a flight early in the morning towards Europe with ice and rain falling all around us. We would started down the runway with a de-icing machine right beside us. And when the pilot took up, he went up as fast as he ever could to get above the rain. It was hair-raising. I thought, well, I guess he's done this before. I think it's their climate. However, that's not my point. I did like the book. I have felt for a long time that our basic economic thinking is off base. And I've been talking to friends and various people because I'm on a number of Zoom calls all the time. And it is extraordinarily difficult to get people to even start to think differently. You're identifying that, but that is something that really concerns me, because it's all very well to do our little bit for the environment or reach out for the neighbor in need and all that kind of stuff that we try to do. But we need a change of mindset among the financial people, for instance, particularly. I think she's right on when she really zeroes in on the financial system, the banking system, regulation of it, and so forth. And it's just, I find myself thinking, where do I, as an individual, even start? Because people look at you, they are so skilled in this Economics 101 that she talks about. They think that way. That's part of who they are. It's a really, really basic change of our self-perception. And so I don't know whether anybody ever has any bright ideas about how to get someone even to look at the book or to take any of its ideas seriously. It's a little frustrating because I do agree a lot with what she's saying.
Well, Nora, besides the fact the wood in your house is beautiful, like the wood ceiling and stuff, like, man, what a beautiful home.
Yeah.
Kate has started a lot of local chapters of Doughnut Economics. She calls it Deal Doughnut Economic Action Labs.
Okay.
So one thing I'd encourage any church or group to look at is watch the videos. She's case studies. She's based in England, so a lot of the towns are in England. But I think, at least for me, or Amsterdam was another one. I'm with you. You know, like, changing behavior is like the hardest thing ever. I emptied my recycling a minute ago, and then I had like 14 cans within minutes. And recycling in general is kind of a myth anyway, because the companies that make the bottles really are the ones that should stop making the bottles. Newsflash, I used to drink water out of the tap. Anybody remember? I'm 54. Like, anybody remember when you put a glass under water, you fill it up and you drink? And there, you didn't have to have bottles. So mostly my influence, hopefully, is coming. I go to policy meetings all the time, and I'm hoping that my influence doesn't justify my behavior if I'm continuing to do whatever. But anyway, all that is to say, Nora, if that's helpful, Kate has all these labs, and they're really doing exciting community level things.
Awesome. Thanks, Nora. We have a question for me in the chat from Judy. It says, other than this fabulous book club, how do you envision the Doughnut Economics mind shift might be encouraged in our churches at all levels, where financial considerations can still drive a lot of decisions? And again, I don't think it's that we shouldn't we shouldn't let finances. I mean, finances do drive our decisions, right? Like, we need to heat and cool our church buildings. We need to pay ministry personnel, or earn some kind of other revenue to support folks, unless we make the decision that we're going to completely re-envision what the model for pastoral ministry looks like in the United Church of Canada. But I could find one of them, but there are a few places where I had written notes in the margins. I like the tangibility of a book, but it's also because, like, mark them up a lot. Can't really, I'm just making myself disappear. But on page 136, where she said, she's talking about Meadows and her, Donella Meadows talking about gardening and economics. And she said she was a skilled economic gardener in this sense, having spent much of her life watching the dance of social ecological systems in action and observing the value of what was already there. In fact, she noted effective systems tend to have three properties: healthy hierarchy, self-organization, and resilience, and so should be stewarded to enable these characteristics to emerge. And I was like, how do we build that in the church? Because she says, in economic terms, healthy hierarchies mean, for example, ensuring that the financial sector is in service to the productive economy, which is in turn in service to life. And I've been thinking, both from my experience of being the executive director at First United and, taking over as the staff lead on a ministry with a 150-year history, but that had been in decline for several decades before I joined and sort of rebuilt the management and leadership team. And there was the building was aging. Many of you know that we embarked on a very audacious $30 million capital campaign that's now a $37 million capital campaign to build this public-private partnership with Luma Native Housing Society and BC Housing in the city of Vancouver to get a new church. And we went through a process of like really examining that our model of how we did ministry that asked some existential questions, right? So the first thing that I asked the board is, are we a ministry that primarily exists to serve the poor? Or are we a ministry that is the presence of the United Church of Canada on the corner of Hastings and Gore like it has been for the last 150 years? Because how I would run this organization is completely different based on those two answers. This is both ministry, but I could go one of two ways. If we're primarily serving the poor and we think that there's a very real possibility through gentrification and a whole bunch of other renewal efforts in this neighborhood that they might be displaced, would we follow them? Or are we the church? Are we United Church on the corner of Hastings and Gore? And if so, like, how do we build a building that's going to last in this community for 60 to 100 years? Because our ministry may shape as the neighborhood around, like our ministry may shift as the neighborhood around us shifts. And when I look at the like trying to transpose that experience of how do we revitalize this ministry? And, like we went from being a $4.2 million budget combined between the Community Ministry Society and the Housing Society, and living with like $500,000 deficits every year, to now just the Ministry Society exists, and it's a $5.2 million organization with a healthy surplus every year. Like healthy in terms of like not too much, not too little, just enough to provide some buffer and resilience. And I think like, how do I think about that in terms of the national church? And I feel like in this economic worldview where we're always taught to be in competition for scarce resources, we grew and matured into this beautiful church that we love. But the church, because of demographic shifts, because of secularization in society, has been in decline. And we're still acting with the models and the infrastructure that supported that mature, large church that was the biggest and continues, however, marginally, to be the biggest Protestant denomination in Canada. But those systems that we develop for mature organization are not nimble when we're at a time of pretty significant change. And as we're declining, we have to think, are we going to go terminal, or are we going to turn around? And if we turn around, we actually have to start thinking like startups again, right? And how do we and so for me, that goes back to this question of like, what is the purpose of our ministry? Like, what are the things that for each of our communities of faith are uniquely ours to do? What's the neighborhood that we serve? Or do we have to serve a neighborhood? Let's start there. Do we have to serve a neighborhood? Or like I imagine some smaller cities in Canada, do they really need 13 United Church of Canadas in them in an age where many people have access to private transportation or public transportation? Like, do we have to have 13 buildings, or could we have 2 in a 20,000 or 50,000 person city? I think there's all kinds of ways that we can re-envision this. And this is one of the reasons why I created the Flourishing Project, which is to encourage people to do this dreaming and visioning, like what is it that we want to have? Because I feel like we're so reactive to this like threat of scarcity, which is falls right into this scarcity mindset that we're taught in our economic worldviews, that we have to be in competition for scarce resources, that we fall out of the practice of generative and innovative thinking because we're always like in a reactive space instead of up here in our prefrontal cortex, where our brains like to dream and imagine and integrate our emotional responses with facts and decision making and community building. I think, some of the work we did over the past few years in the national church, that is one of the reasons why we made growth a strategic imperative, is that 40% of people under the age of 40, I think, in Canada say that they would like to belong to a church like the United Church of Canada if they thought one existed. Right? So, but I think when we look at what does it mean to broaden what church looks like, and the way that the world has shifted since we sort of created this mature organization, this mature institution that's centered around Sunday morning worship. And many people's lives aren't built around a work week that has a Sabbath in it anymore, right? Either because they're having to work 2 or 3 jobs in order to make ends meet, or because children's sports events happen on Sunday mornings now, and they never used to. Even when I was little, you never played sports on Sundays 40 years ago. So, I think the thing I like about this book is that she makes you think deeply about all of the impacts. And when I think about stewardship in the church, when I think about the way that we were able to turn things around at First United, like we really started with what's our vision for this community, not just what's our mission or what's like our calling or purpose, but like what do we envision happening if we say we're going to be the church in this neighborhood. So we articulated it that we envisioned a neighborhood where the worth of every person was celebrated and all people thrived. Because that was something that we could imagine 50 or 100 years from now, where if the neighborhood stayed poor, or one of the poorer neighborhoods in Canada, then at least we would want to celebrate the worth of every person in that neighborhood, but that we were also working to create a neighborhood where people thrived, and that encompassed more than just their economic selves. And so if the neighborhood changed around us, we also wanted to envision that for our neighbors. And I think that it really gets to the heart of us rumbling with our new call and vision. Like, I think we're really good at the deep spirituality. I think we're really good at the daring justice. I don't think we're so good at the bold discipleship part of our new call and vision. Like, we really have to rumble with, like, what does it mean to be a disciple of Christ in a way that is, to borrow from 12-step programs, like practicing attraction rather than promotion, right? Like, we sort of threw out the evangelism bathwater with the colonial missions baby. Nope, other way around. We threw out the evangelism baby with the colonial missions bathwater, because we don't want to be like those type of missionaries or those type of evangelists anymore, but then we don't talk about our faith publicly. And so, the fact that there's 40% of young people in our country that would be interested to know more about a church like ours if they thought one existed, maybe we need to rumble with what discipleship looks like.
And Carmen, if this helps us, I know we're closing. So again, just thank you so much to you and this community. A fact about loneliness, which I didn't realize when I first started studying it, but it's pretty makes sense from a common sense standpoint. If I was like to walk up to you, Carmen, and be like, Carmen, are you lonely? You'd kind of be like, okay, let's back off, right? But if I came up and we were chatting and I said, I'm really lonely, I'm struggling with isolation, in whatever way that empathy would be aroused, that's usually then where people will say, I struggle with it too. And I bring this up because that I think, again, Carmen, you're the minister. I've worked with ministers. I was in an office for years working with at a Baptist church, and I don't know the physical area where you are in Canada. I put this thing, the Happy Movie. If you get a chance, it's a beautiful documentary, and they actually have a scene in Denmark where essentially it's kind of like a longhouse, almost like an indigenous longhouse logic. It's 10 apartments linked to a long hallway with a communal kitchen, or in the US, like a lot of senior assisted living homes function. I mean, frankly, I'm wrapping this together in sort of one of our final points. Like, I dream, I'm 54. I want to go to if I can afford one, I'd like to live in a senior assisted living home now, kind of, like, I have a partner, a girlfriend, I'm hoping to get married, but there are many times, like when she's traveling or something, I just lonely, it's like, and it's like, if I was able to, go down the hallway and make dinner, because like in the movie, they show like this woman who's in her 30s crying because she's so happy. As she points out, she's like, if I had to have a job in the main part of the city in Copenhagen, I would never get to see my kids because I can't afford caregivers. But here, the senior folks are like the uncles and aunties to my kids, and they take care of them, and then the kids learn how to make food. And anyway, there's a lot of stuff with smarter cities that I'm really excited about, caring cities, where again, Carmen, I don't want to speak to your specific examples, but like more and more, if there's like this awareness of, this separation. There's a great book called Happy City, by the way. There's a fascinating point in there in Happy City that in the US, one of the main ways that the family broke up, where I was used to hearing about people not sitting at the dinner table every night, leading to like drugs and stuff. It was actually when FDR created the Work Progress Administration for highways. Then what happened is people were able to go longer distances to work, and they didn't spend as much time at home. So this is not to be upset about FDR. But anyway, what I'll say here is the economics of care, the ways to bring cities together and people together around a church. And for me, I know what you mean about the Sunday Sabbath thing. Like, if I was able to live in a place where the nights I didn't feel like seeing people, I'd stay in my apartment or my condo where I live now. But then the other nights where I just really wanted to have human contact and not be isolated and like walk down the hall and be with other people that I knew. These are constructs that a lot of, at least in America, where I live, there's this this deep ideological focus inspired by neoliberalism that you have to do everything on your own. And factually, it runs counter to psychology. Factually, it runs counter to, I think common sense. And then I also think, frankly, what God created us to be with other people and to love other people. And to your point, Carmen, being a disciple, keeping your light under a bush and all that, like, that's not how I think God wants us to live our lives. If we're outside of proselytizing and formally asking someone to accept Christ as their savior, is the opportunity, and I believe mandate, to be with other people and do your utmost to love them well. And I'm at the age where it's kind of selfish too. Like, I want to create the structures that mean me and my kids, or someone like Carmen, who's a dear friend. How do we create structures that the caring economy, if we call it that or not, is just what we embody as a society, and move away from this really massively, horrifically destructive and frankly world-ending ideology that says, no, I need more stuff, and no, it's all about me. Like Adam Smith, a lot of the economists that we think, had those messages, really changed their messages at the end of their lives and kind of got to the golden rule mindset. And Carmen, I'll just say thank you again. This book has really inspired me. I love that it inspired you. I want to take it back to the Vatican and that community, and really, really just continue to highlight Kate's work, which I'm really impressed with.
Yeah. Nora, you had your hand up again. Do you want the last word for a minute?
That's good. Well, I'll try to make everybody feel a little more. when I was in active ministry and before I retired, I often was working with the oversight committee in a local church here. I remember well an oversight visit at the beginning of the 90s, and their treasurer sat there and said, I don't know. I don't think we've got more than 3 years. I look at our trust, we're really facing a bad time. They're still there 30 years later. And I think that there are still enough people in our churches who understand that being there in the community and not just helping out the poor, but just being the body of Christ in the world, as it were, is what we're about. And our treasurers, all in my experience, all are gloomy, always. That's part of being a treasurer, right? But we need to get away from thinking of our churches just as an economic model. The church is there to create the joy and the love of Christ all around us, however that looks. And sure, the balance sheet can look pretty awful, but you know what? It gets worked out. Somebody emerges who's got a fundraiser that brings you through another year, so you can go on being the body of Christ in the world. And I really hope we can get out of this GDP growth thing, because I think it's affected the way our effectiveness, and that's really too bad. But on the other hand, I do have the faith that people generally are wiser than many of our economists.
Wise words to end by. Thank you, Nora. I don't think I can say anything that's a better recap than that. Thanks again to everybody for joining tonight. Thanks to Jocelyn for coming and sharing about your reading club. And we'll look forward to connecting in November, where we're going to be reading The Wall That Divides, very timely read, written by Raja Khoury and Jeffrey Wilkinson. Jeffrey is a psychologist. Raja is a management consultant, but is a former president of the Canadian Arab Federation. And they came together in an interfaith project to try and use trauma-informed psychology to look at the ways that Muslims and Jews in North America talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and what they do and don't want to know about each other. And so, of course, we're holding the people of Gaza and of Israel in our hearts, and the West Bank, the whole of the Palestinian territories, for just like the huge amount of warmongering that is happening on both sides. And so really, really grateful to both Raja and Jeffrey that they'll be joining us next month to talk about their book. You won't be able to get it for about another 10 days or so. It comes out on Halloween. And so, but it's not a long book. And so we'll look forward to talking no, it came out on September 30th. I lied. I didn't only give you like 2 weeks to read the book, but it's newly out. And so I know we have copies at UCRD, and you should also be able to buy it at local or bigger bookstores if that's where you choose to shop. Thanks again to John for joining us. Really appreciate it so much, and appreciate everything that you're doing in your corner of the world and the ministry that you are doing, because I know it comes from a deeply faith-founded space, even though you're working in a secular realm with engineers. And so thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks, everybody.